You're listening to Flipping the Channel, conversations with experts and executives from the electronics industry. In each episode, we attempt to understand and unravel some of the business and technical challenges brought on by component obsolescence. Here's your host, Bill Bradford, President of Flip Electronics.
Welcome to this episode of Flipping the Channel, and I'm very pleased to have as our guest the President and CEO of the Electronic Component Industry Association, David Loftus. David, coming to us from the friendly skies, it looks like. Welcome, Dave.
Hey, Bill. Great to be here.
Thanks for being on the show. So we've had some similar career paths. You spent a lot of years in the semiconductor business. Why don't you just recap for our listeners kind of your career path?
Sure. So like you said, we've had a lot of parallel paths along the way. I started my career as an electrical engineer, did a few years of design, but I got into the semiconductor business in the early 90s, started with a field apps engineer with Xilinx, rose up through the sales management ranks, had an opportunity to run Asia for them for a few years back in the early 2000s, came back to Silicon Valley and ran a couple of business units. And then I stepped out to go to Intersil in 2008. So I went from the digital world to the broadline analog world. And that was quite the switch. I ran worldwide sales and marketing for them, jumped through Cypress, and then I finished up my semiconductor career running sales and marketing for Maxim Integrated, another broadline analog company. So I stepped out of the semiconductor business in late 2019 and had intended really to focus on consulting and board work. I had moved back to Atlanta with my family. That's where we were originally from years ago. We crossed paths there in our backgrounds. Yeah. And my wife and kids had wanted to come back to Atlanta. So that was part of the reason of stepping away from Silicon Valley. And then this bright gentleman named Bill Bradford had talked me into this current role with ECIA. And I'll tell you, I'm just thrilled that we had that conversation. ECIA, we can talk about that here in just a second, but the role that I've incidentally learned mostly over Zoom calls like this is a lot of fun. I love the semiconductor business, and I was tremendously fortunate with the career that I had. At the same time, ECIA is a little bit different in the way that really just trying to get so many members to be able to work together on a lot of the problems that chased me through 30 years of my career in the semiconductor world. And so for me, it's really a fantastic opportunity to be able to stay in touch with the business and a lot of people that I like and admire. And it's also a way for me to sort of give back to the business that has been so good to me for 30 years. So having a lot of fun with it.
Good. Well, for those that may not be very familiar with the ECIA, why don't you just briefly tell what the primary focus and charter of that organization is?
Sure. So ECIA stands for the Electronic Components Industry Association. ECIA as a name has only been around for about 10 years, but its parent companies actually trace their roots back almost 100 years to the early days of radio. ECIA was formed by the merger of NEDA, the National Electronics Distribution Association, and ECA, the Electronic Components Association, in 2011. And the interesting thing about our membership is ECA was probably a little more focused with IP&E electronic components manufacturers, interconnect, passive, and electromechanical. Had some semiconductor members on both the NEDA side and the ECAA side. And over the last 10 years, through your efforts, and now I'm trying to continue the efforts, we're trying to continue to grow the semiconductor memberships. We've got a lot of marquee names: Analog Devices, onsemi, Infineon, Renesas, a lot of really good semiconductor guys, but we are missing some of the big guys, and we're going to continue to try to pursue to bring them into the ECIA fold. And as many trade organizations are based in DC, and they're focused on public policy initiatives like National Association of Manufacturers, NAM, and SIA, which is probably resonates with a lot of your listeners, the Semiconductor Industry Association. They work on public policy initiatives like immigration, environment, tax reform, trade policy, IP protection, pre-competitive investment in research. But ECIA, what really resonated with me in our initial conversation about it was that it's really focused on practical, everyday issues of trying to make our business more efficient and effective. A big project we're working on right now is around design registration. We are working with blunting counterfeits. I mean, really, I think one of the critical things about ECIA is that we stand for the authorized channel, really trying to ensure that people, that customers of the electronic components industry are buying legitimate authorized product rather than off the gray market or counterfeits and so forth. And so we sponsor a really neat website called trustedparts.com. This is a brainchild of our distributor members a number of years ago. And it's a inventory site that customers of electronic components can hit, and they are 100% assured that it is full authorized product through authorized channels that convey the full warranty of the original manufacturer. And so that's being really successful. The other things, we sponsor several industry events. We're a major sponsor of EDS, which we're very happy to say is going to come back in August of this year. We have our annual executive conference. And two other things that we do is we do a lot of original market research. Under Bill's leadership, we brought in a fantastic chief analyst, Dale Ford, who has a lot of history with DataQuest, and he was one of the original guys in iSupply, and I went into IHS with a merge there. And we also have a lot of work in standards, mostly around IP&E, and the semiconductor standards are mostly driven by JADEC. But we actually do a lot of standards work as well. So anyway, we do a lot of different things for our members, a lot of great services, and it's a wonderful way for industry leaders to be able to network and work together cooperatively on tough issues that face our industry.
Great. Well, between researching this market and the focus on the supply chain and the whole channel, certainly a lot of you can't pick up the newspaper without reading about supply chain issues in the semiconductor business. How would you kind of characterize the market and the supply chain today?
Well, we're certainly, that's great question. I mean, we're certainly seeing continued tightness. Lead times are continuing to extend in certain things, especially in things like micros and analog and discretes and so forth. We're seeing manufacturers, do reasonably broad price increases, and the inflation is hitting the semiconductor business and other parts of our membership, just like a lot of other parts of the economy right now. When we're coming out of the pandemic, there's just tremendous demand, and sometimes terms are a little bit tougher. A lot of new orders being placed on the books are being required to be NCNR, so that manufacturers really can rely upon the backlog that is placed. We want to make sure that there's minimal double ordering and any kind of speculative buys that are going on. So they're requiring people to put NCNR orders in place. And the question is, how long is this going to last, and what should the industry do about it? And overall, I'm sort of I'm a little bit bipolar on this. I mean, in some ways, I think that we will. This is not going to be a multi-year kind of shortage. I think that really it's been the perfect storm with the fact that the semiconductor business, especially, was in a downturn that had started back in late 2018, maybe mid to late 2018. Semiconductor market has always gone through up and down cycles every 4 to 5 years, and we were just climbing out of that at the end of 2019, beginning of 2020, when the pandemic hit, and everybody slams on the brakes. And that's sort of an analogy that I like to use. This is a situation, it's like you're on the 405 freeway in Los Angeles, and somebody taps on the brakes, and all the cars pile up behind it. And then an hour later, there's still a traffic jam there because, and there's no reason for it. It's just that happens that everybody bunched up. And that's what's happening right now. Everybody is bunched up right now, trying to get their production volumes back up for the economy that's being reopened around the world. And everyone had bled their inventories significantly in the downturn, but then also bled them even more significantly during the pandemic, at the beginning of the pandemic, before they realized that, hey, the world's not falling apart. And there really is demand out there. And the other aspect of this is you're seeing that just trillions of dollars being pumped into economies that have somewhat artificially inflated the short-term demand. And you hear Pat Gelsinger from Intel, a really smart guy, and he says that this is going to go on for another couple of years. I don't know, maybe for a few limited pieces of the market, but I do think that once stimulus dries up a little bit, that the economies are going to come back to earth, and you're going to see more of a steady state environment. The other analogy that I sort of use is toilet paper. Everybody's talking about adding capacity. U.S. wants to throw $50 to $100 billion at it. Europe's thrown tens of billions of dollars. TSMC themselves are saying, hundreds of billions of dollars in added capacity. I'm afraid of the industry getting over capacity and building for this really tremendously unique inflection point that we're in right now. If we brought on several $100 billion worth of capacity a couple years from now, just as the markets are coming back to normal, I would be afraid of overcapacity in the market. Prices
that's never happened before in our industry.
Well, not to the scale that they're talking about now. Right. So I'm all for having supply chain security for the U.S., and other people ought to be thinking about their supply chain security. At the same time, you just got to think about how much capacity can be brought online and be able to be utilized at a high enough level that it's profitable to be able to run those fabs. So I am somewhat concerned about that longer term.
Mm-hmm. So a couple months ago, you penned an op-ed that the Wall Street Journal picked up and kind of pointed the finger a little bit at the auto industry and how some of this is self-inflicted by kind of years of how they've handled the supply chain from a customer perspective. You want to just kind of expound on your thoughts there a little bit? Sure.
And I don't want to badmouth any of the customers of the electronic components industry in any way, but I did go out and make some public statements in a lot of different that got picked up around the world, really, with Economic Times of India and some others as well. And the fact that a lot of people created some of their own problems. Mm-hmm. Automotive, they obviously get a justifiable amount of attention because it employs so many people. It's so big a part of the economy. And when they started putting orders on the books in late 2020 and early 2021 and found that lead times had stretched tremendously, they ended up having to shut production lines down, and that is and idling tens of thousands of workers. And obviously that's a very painful thing for those companies, but it's also a painful thing for the world economies that support and that they support and lose tax revenue and so forth. And so, the point that I was making in a number of these articles was really that in some ways they shot themselves in the foot. There are certain businesses like smartphones that run in very high volume on a limited number of components. And those guys rightfully buy most of their product direct from manufacturers. Automotive manufacturers have been known for the last several decades of running very lean inventories, just-in-time replenishment models, VMI, vendor managed inventory, and so forth. But one thing that they did really over the last 10 to 15 years is they really eschewed the channel. They just thought that they needed to be direct customers of the semiconductor manufacturers, even though automotive, for the most part, is more of a high mix, lower volume type of business than say smartphone manufacturers. Most manufacturers, not all, but most manufacturers would like automotive customers, and this is mostly the tier ones and the suppliers to the OEMs, like them to go through the channel just because of that mix and because of their ordering processes, plus the value-added services that they really demand. But really, starting about 10 or 15 years ago, a lot of these procurement arms in the automotive suppliers started putting guns to the heads of VPs of worldwide sales. You and I have faced this in common, that you get a chief purchasing officer that basically says, you will do business with me direct, or I will go to your competition and I won't do business with you. So and what happens in that is, first off, the automotive guys were late to the party in 2020. Certainly when the pandemic began and millions and millions of people have to work remotely, and hundreds of millions of kids are having to go to remote classrooms, the PC guys, the cell phone guys, the tablet guys, all of the data center guys started to put orders on the books, and lead time started to stretch. And in late 2020, you had automotive guys that were still coming to semiconductor executives and saying, "Hey, cancel my orders, and by the way, you will take these products back from me," and they're dealing with them on a direct basis. And the point in this set of articles is just that there is a tremendous value in the channel. There's a reason that semiconductor manufacturers and other electronic component manufacturers support the channel, is because they are really what I call the impedance match between a manufacturer that wants to generate very large volumes and ship very large quantities on a single line item, versus distributors that are incredibly good at aggregating orders over many customers. They're very good at working with customers on advanced forecasts, buffering inventory in plenty of time to be able to handle these kind of supply chain fluctuations. And so the point was really that for security of the supply chain, people really should listen to the recommendations of manufacturers about how they do business with them, and a lot of them should really be supporting the channel, at least for a reasonable percentage of their business, and utilize the value-added services that they offer.
This concludes part one of this interview. David had a wealth of information to share, and we decided to split this episode into two segments. Please stay tuned for part two of this episode, where we will discuss the challenges of end-of-life products in the supply chain.
You've been listening to Flipping the Channel. This podcast is brought to you by Flip Electronics, where we're making obsolescence obsolete. Visit www.flipelectronics.com for your authorized, hard-to-find, end-of-life electronic component requirements.